I think the important thing about Impressionism really is its relationship to modernity. In many ways, as art historians, we think of Impressionism as the first truly modern art movement arising out of the concern of the realists. It really takes shape in the 1860s and is very much inspired by a new concern with contemporary life, that is a rejection of the academy, a rejection of history painting, and a concern with showing both modern urban experience and showing nature, not in terms of historical nature or of the paysage historique as it was called in French at the time, but modest contemporary natural scene, bourgeois recreation, modest village scenes. And I think particularly for Monet, we shouldn't forget that his particular concern was with the fleeting and the ephemeral, with very evanescent effects of the atmosphere. And that, in a sense, is the truly revolutionary impact of Impressionism, that as a movement it was concerned with showing natural effects that are fleeting, with light, movement, and the atmosphere. And of course, Monet himself was very much obsessed by this. I'm paraphrasing now, but he once famously said that he wasn't really interested in the motive as such, but in the things that were lying between the motive and him. And by this he meant the play of the atmosphere, the play of light and shadow, the play of the elements that were surrounding the objects. And in a way, it's this interest in the evanescent and the fugitive that also led to the establishment of his famous series as the 1890s. And to me, certainly, the key interest in Impressionism in the history of modern painting is this search for the evanescent, and which ultimately is the modern, if you like. The idea of painting in open nature, or plein air painting, as it's called in French, is really a key aspect of Impressionism. Of course, it was very common already at the beginning of the 19th century for artists to work out of doors, but usually this was limited to preliminary studies, to sketches. The idea was that you would go out of doors, you would look at a specific effect, it might be a sunrise or sunset, for instance, and you very quickly capture this as an oil sketch on paper. And the revolutionary thing about the Impressionists was that they dissolved this boundary between the preliminary study on the one hand and the final painting on the other. To a certain extent, the sketch became indistinguishable from the tableau as they tried to incorporate the idea of the sketch into Impressionist compositions. So you have to imagine Monet and his generation of painters, they were really amongst the first artists who would take the canvas itself out with them into nature, would paint in front of the motive, and at times really create almost the entire composition out of doors, not in the studio. And this had quite dramatic effects, really. If you think about the studio composition, tend to be quite glossy, with a play of chiaroscuro, a very strong focus on perspective, on a hierarchy of pictorial elements. And in the Impressionist paintings, because they were done to such a great extent out of doors, there was a greater emphasis on natural light. The colors in general were much brighter. They were often perceived by contemporaries as glaring and unnatural, and the composition had a kind of atmosphere of the vivid and the spontaneous that was revolutionary at the period. I think if we think of Impressionism as a movement, most people immediately think of Paris as the capital of the movement. It's in Paris that most Impressionists meet, that they study together. Paris is an important subject of Impressionist paintings. And it's also French capital, where the famous Impressionist exhibitions take place from 1874 onwards, and they're very important for our recognition of the movement as a kind of coherent force for the French avant-garde at the time. But at the same time, for Monet, there can be no doubt that Giverny is the most important place in terms of the development of his art, especially for his late work. It's a very picturesque village located directly at the bank of the River Seine, around 65 kilometers northwest of Paris, and Monet settles there in 1883 together with his family. At first he rents a very modest farmhouse, but he quickly establishes himself there in these beautiful picturesque surroundings, and it's in 1890 that he acquires the house and the surrounding land. Of course, famously, in the early 1890s, he expands the land with a beautiful water garden where he installs this magnificent pond, which is inspired by the example of Japanese gardens, and he cultivates it with native homegrown plants, but also with exotic flowers, and of course amongst them the beautiful nymphea or the water lilies. And it's really the garden in Giverny and this amazing pond, the Japanese bridge he has installed, and the water lilies that become an obsessive pursuit in Monet's late career. And of course, it's an enormous time span between 1883 and 1926. So in terms of evolution, it's really more than 4 decades that he spends at Giverny as an incredibly prolific and productive artist. But to a certain extent, it's also the importance art historically of the Nymphaeas in Monet's art that makes Giverny so important to understanding of Monet as a painter. He has this very unusual focus. He shows the water surface as this reflection of color and light, which is very abstract. Often he has a very daring focus directly on the pond without any kind of illusion of depth in the space, really. And to some extent, you might say that paradoxically, the surface of the pond becomes a doubling of the canvas itself. So it's a radical gesture towards abstraction. And to my mind, that's why Giverny is so important in Monet's development. To my mind, it absolutely makes sense for this Monet exhibition to be a cooperation between a museum in the US and a museum in Germany. It's both countries, of course, that played a key role in the early reputation of Monet as a leading exponent of the French avant-garde. It's 2 countries where he was very early on hailed as one of the great precursors of abstraction. And for us, it was a really great pleasure to work with the colleagues in Denver on this particular project. Of course, for us here at the Barberini, one of the challenges was that we had a great opening exhibition in 2017 that was dedicated to Impressionism and the art of the landscape. And in our Monet show, really, our aim is not so much to just look at Impressionism in terms of their interest in nature, in their general interest in landscape as such, but we're really trying to look at why Monet in particular developed such a close focus on specific localities. If you like, he was sometimes obsessed with one and the same place. He repeatedly went back there, painted over and over again, both on his travels and of course in terms of the locations he was looking at in terms of own houses, if you think of Argenteuil, of Vinteuil and Giverny. And what we're trying to do here at the Barberini certainly is to tease out why these different places inspired him to such a great extent. So you can walk through the exhibition and you will really realize why it's Holland, why it's London, why it's Argenteuil, why it's Paris that inspires him at significant junctures in his career.